Lazola, Kuzambo, and good morning to all of you, respected Limbo, our speakers, moderators, and all the participants. So on behalf of Center for Local Governance and Center for the Study of Democracy, University of Westminster, London, I would like to thank Honorable Limbo Ugindoji, Minister for Labour and Human Resources, Royal Government of Bhutan, for agreeing to be the keynote speaker to set the tone of our second Biodemocracy Conference 2020. We also thank all our panelists and moderators here for agreeing to take part and deliver on different thematic areas for the conference by sacrificing all your valuable time. This annual Biodemocracy Conference is an offshoot of our partnership between Center for Local Governance and Center for the Study of Democracy UK. We successfully had our first Biodemocracy Conference in 2019. For this, I would like to personally thank Professor Natasha for taking a lead role in fostering our partnership. We here at the Center for Local Governance look forward to initiate the role in initiating various academic discourse in future under the same flagship of our partnership. Thank you so much, Professor Natasha, once again. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought deaths and sufferings for millions globally. Currently, the whole world is confronted with unprecedented challenges, politically, economically, and socially. The virus had badly exposed all our vulnerabilities in governance, health systems, food security, and employment sectors, to name few. Here in Bhutan, we are fortunate to have His Majesty, the King, with his wise political leadership and continuous guidance for the government and his citizens during these challenging times. Now, complacency is neither an option nor an alternative for us at the midst of this pandemic. We all take a united lead role together to reflect and prepare to recover from this global pandemic. Therefore, it is very important for us to have a serious discourse to discuss and debate on the challenges we faced and opportunities that we may need to explore from this pandemic, for which we have 16 exciting speakers and 5 moderators to host this year's Biodemocracy Conference on 5 different thematic areas. So for day 1, we have economic vulnerability and climate change, which will be moderated by Ms. Namgye Choden from New Delhi, who is working in Foreign Ministry. And the second panel, we have volunteerism and public health, and this will be moderated by Dr. Karma Tenzin, Deputy Dean, Gesageva University of Medical Sciences. And third one, we have local governance, and this will be moderated by Mr. Leki Wangdi. He's an advisor to Helvetis on local governance. So followed by the roundtable discussion joined by all the moderators here and Professor Natasha from London. So with this, I would like to request Honorable Limbo, our chief guest, for your keynote address. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Limbo.
I must firstly say how delighted I am to be able to speak at this conference. I think it's truly a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful platform to share our ideas, experiences, craft solutions, and basically reflect on our way forward out of the pandemic situation that we are currently in. I've been asked to give a keynote address, but I'm not very sure how successful I will be at doing that, because I realize the topic itself is so vast, wide-ranging, and also looking at the portfolio of the speakers, I believe the speakers do not really need to be guided by the keynote address. Nevertheless, I'd like to make an attempt to share my views on the ongoing situation, the coronavirus pandemic, the challenges that our country faces, as I see it, and some of the ideas that all of us must collectively pursue in order for a country to build back better out of this pandemic. But before I even get into the subject itself, I must congratulate the Center for Local Governance and Research and the Westminster University, represented by Dr. Natasha. I think this is a wonderful initiative. It's always very encouraging to see our local think tank collaborating with think tanks abroad and trying to reach out to the world, to communicate to the world the narratives that Bhutanese ourselves must own, must promote. And, uh, and I think this is exactly how we uh, pursue our public discourse that would ultimately lead to better decision making, whether it is at the governmental level or in individual private capacities. This year we have encountered this coronavirus pandemic. Uh, we have we have heard about it, but it took some time to come to Bhutan. But once it got into Bhutan, I think we are all taken by a surprise in a way, because we realized how unprepared we were for the situation. That's not to blame anyone, because this is a crisis of an unprecedented nature. People say that a crisis of this magnitude and nature has been encountered only around a century ago. So I don't really think it is anybody's fault. But when it came, we were really taken by surprise. When the coronavirus, the arrival of coronavirus into Bhutan was announced on March 6th this year, I think there was a lot of panic going around among the public, and we all have lived through this experience. And I don't really feel I need to elaborate on the kind of experiences that we have all had with the coronavirus for almost a year now. But what we also saw, uh, a ray of hope in the middle of this difficulty and pandemic, really was the leadership from His Majesty the King. From day one, I personally saw His Majesty taking charge of the situation, taking charge of the responsibility to combat the pandemic. I observed His Majesty uh, at the conference hall, in the conference hall of the Ministry of Health. By then it was early morning, March 6th. I realized His Majesty and the team has been at work throughout the night, and looking at how His Majesty, it concerned His Majesty, the gravity and the weight of the responsibility, the challenge that we were to encounter for the rest of the year. I could see it, read it from the expression on the faces of all the people who were gathered there in the hall. We were not very sure, but right from day one, we felt a sense of security and a sense of comfort in the leadership of His Majesty the King. The words of His Majesty, even in the face of difficulty like that, because that really was the day one of the pandemic, it inspired a lot of hope and enthusiasm in us. A feeling that despite the huge challenge that we were facing, that we were preparing ourselves for, we would still be able to overcome this challenge. And true to this instincts that we had, we got those of us who were gathered in that room on that first day. I think for the rest of the year, we all saw His Majesty leading the nation in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. We saw His Majesty touring the country, His Majesty basically inspecting all the border in the south, in the north, and the Desung program, which was accelerated after the pandemic came in. We also saw the people from all walks of life, private businesses, individuals, government agencies, all coming together to join His Majesty the King in fighting this pandemic. So these are stories. Basically, I don't really want to go in depth because we have all lived through this experience, but I'm basically trying to give an overview, rather a glimpse into how we started off this year. Along the process, along the way, what we have realized is our systems, our structures, our policies are not really prepared for such a pandemic. And going forward, we don't really know when the next pandemic will come. Like His Excellency, the Honorable Prime Minister of Bhutan repeatedly mentions, maybe this time is COVID-19, but we don't know when the next COVID will come. Maybe it will be COVID-25, maybe it will be COVID-30. What do we do then? Unless we prepare for such a pandemic, such a situation, learning from the experiences that we have had so far, the shortcomings that we have been able to see within ourselves, And when I talk about shortcomings and the challenges, there are so many to list. And some of the challenges can very well be fit into the 5 broad themes that you have identified for this conference. So how do we build back better? In other words, how do we make ourselves resilient in the face of difficulty like this, in the face of a pandemic situation like this? I think the good start would be to look at some of the loopholes, the gapping holes that we saw uh, uh, within our system during this pandemic. There are many, but let's look at our economy. It's import driven, as we all know. It's hydropower dependent. Um, we are dependent on the foreign workers, foreign laborers. And once we have closed our borders in the south, we immediately face the difficulty of the foreign workers shortage in the country. And as a result, um, we have all seen how the economy has almost come to a grinding halt because of the dependence on the foreign workers. On an annual basis, we import about 50,000 foreign workers. But this year, because exactly around the time the foreign workers were to enter the country, we closed our borders. And as a result, our economy has suffered throughout the year. The construction sector has almost come to a halt. Even in the manufacturing and other sectors, things have not been that easy, exactly because of the labor shortage. So that is one of the problems that we have encountered. But even on the other import front, the commodities, essentials, we all have seen how difficult it has been. We have put in place measures to ensure that there is a continuous flow of goods in and out of the country. But despite the maximum, the unusual effort put in by our agencies, we are still not able to continue the trade in volumes that would normally be required for the economy to function in a normal circumstances. So things like this have really put us back to our senses. We all saw where the hole is, but I suppose we are still struggling, rather trying to figure out uh, the way forward. And it is in this light that I feel the conference that you are conducting is very relevant and timely. It's through sharing of ideas, public discourse like this, that we will be able to arrive at some of the good ideas that might serve our country well going forward. As a labor minister, uh, I'd be remiss if I did not talk about the situation of unemployment. Apart from the positive cases, coronavirus positive cases that we're encountering and the toll it is taking on our public health infrastructure, I think the kind of negative worsening impact that it had on the economy and the situation of unemployment, I think is a matter of concern. A few months ago, His Majesty gave us a gave audience to some of the cabinet ministers, not some, but all of the cabinet ministers at Lungtifu. And I clearly remember His Majesty mentioned that after coronavirus, it is the problem of economy and the unemployment that concerns His Majesty the most. And it is in this light that we must all be concerned about the worsening unemployment situation in the country. If we speak in terms of numbers, I think the number is close to 50,000 so far. If we were to include the new labor market, entrance into the labor market, thousands of graduates coming out of the schools and colleges and the universities, both within the country and abroad. So how do we tackle this situation? Thousands of these people will be coming out of the schools and colleges only to see a situation where it will be difficult for them to find hope and optimism. And it is very dangerous for a generation of people coming out of the colleges to be met with a situation that is not so hopeful. I think that is going to be a disaster, because we all say that the future of our country lies in the hands of our youth. And if our youth start off out of their colleges and schools with that sense of pessimism and desperation, and into a very bleak scenario, the future that they have kept hearing about. They kept hearing from the government policymakers, the leaders, and their seniors. I think it is exactly this group of people that we have to be mindful of. We must find ways to give them hope. It's not really at this point about coming out, being able to come up with concrete solutions and concrete strategies. We must tackle problems head on a maybe monthly basis, on a daily basis. And in that situation, it will be very difficult for us to come up with one fixed solution and a way forward. While we manage the problem on a daily basis as it comes along, as we go along, I think more important for us to keep that hope and optimism among our younger generation, which otherwise they're filled with, in order for us to be able to start off on a very firm footing going forward. Without that optimism and energy, dynamism, that sense of drive among our youth is going to be very difficult for us, because ultimately, whether we are talking about economy, whether we're talking about governance, or all the issues that the country faces, it has to ultimately boil down to its human capital. It has to boil down to its younger generation of educated citizens who will have to shoulder this responsibility of building back better. In this regard, the Labour Ministry has tried to come up with some programs. As you might have read in the media, we have come up with a Build Bhutan project. We saw an opportunity in the construction sector because the 50,000 of the foreign workers who couldn't come to the country were mostly engaged in the construction sector. We thought that was an opportunity that could serve as an opportunity for those people who have been laid off from the tourism and hospitality sector, from other sectors which are not doing that well. Because like I mentioned earlier, we had that labor shortage in the construction sector and the manufacturing sector. We came up with that Build Bhutan project to basically provide a platform for the people to come forward and serve the country, provide a platform for people to make their living out of this work in the construction sector. And I am very glad to report that so far, in the last 4 or 5 months of its commencement, we have been able to attract about 1,000 graduates. I know the progress has been slow. 1,000 in the face of 30, 40,000 is not a big number, not at all an encouraging figure. But this is just a start. And if in 4 to 5 months, we are able to attract about 1,000, we have reasons to hope that we'll be able to do more. We'll be able to attract thousands more in the coming years. And that should be able to an extent, address the problem of unemployment and the labor shortage at the same time. But we're not saying that construction sector is the future for a younger generation. I think the opportunities will have to be much more diverse. We will need to look for, come up with, rather provide our younger generation with better opportunities. It's in this light that His Majesty commanded the government during the audience a few months back in Lungtifu to come up with engagement program, basically to keep the morale of our youth high, to give them reasons for hope and optimism. That we are working to come up with engagement and skilling program in collaboration with the private training providers in all areas, from ICT to hospitality, food and beverages, in all areas of that are relevant for economy. We want to carry out a mass skilling program for them for the next 1 year. The program is yet to be endorsed or rather approved by the cabinet, but the ministry has been at that task for the last 2 to 3 months. The other area that we are talking about is more into capitalize on the sense of spirit of volunteerism that has come into existence in abundance over the last few months. We want to tap on that potential and provide opportunity for people to really volunteer their services. Similar to the UN Volunteers Program that we see, a program that would support the socio-economic development around the world, a program that would fill in the gaps in terms of the human resources and the workforce that are required in different sectors of the economy. We are coming up with a similar program. Whether we call it a volunteers program, apprenticeship program, or a community service program, we are aiming to engage thousands of them, 10,000, 20,000 if possible, over the course of next 1 year, to keep them engaged and help them contribute towards nation building. These are just some of the initiatives that the government, and in particular the Labour Ministry, has been taking. But for us to be able to build back better, I think the interventions will have to be much more than that. It will have to be multi-sectoral. It will have to be through collaborations. It will have to be through consultations, because the need of the economy and the society is really diverse and wide-ranging. Going forward, one of the key tasks that the nation has, the government has rather, is to really chart out a clear economic roadmap going into the 21st century. And on that front, we have all heard through the media and from the government that the government has been, for the last 1 year, working on developing a 21st century economic roadmap. And I think everything will start from there. How do we organize our economy? How do we organize our society? And what do we need to do in order to fulfill that aspiration, the vision that would be laid out in that roadmap? So from there, the human capital, whether it's about educating our people, our younger generation, skilling our people, whether it has got to do with reforming our policies and regulations, whether it's about looking for newer solutions that are in line with the 21st century requirements. I think everything will basically flow from there, and then by the beginning of the coming year, we should all have a vision that we would be working towards. But the discussions on the themes that you all are carrying out in this conference, I think will go a long way to contribute in terms of helping the government make informed decisions, in terms of adding value to the economic century roadmap that is being worked on by a team that has been commissioned by the Honorable Prime Minister a few months ago. I can go on and on, but in the interest of time, I'd rather want to stop here. But before I really stop, I would like to once again thank the Center for Local Governance and Research and Westminster University for giving me this wonderful platform. I know I didn't do justice to this opportunity that I was given, but I hope some of the views, the thoughts that I have in my mind would help to an extent guide the discussion and the deliberations in the coming 2 days, that the conference has been planned for. I must congratulate all the speakers speaking on themes from climate change to economic vulnerability, volunteerism, public health, agriculture, hydropower, tourism, employment. I think all these subjects that are worth pursuing. And I hope the outcomes of the deliberations and the discussions that will continue for the next 2 days will influence the public opinion, will give the government in particular and the nation at large some ideas, some insights, and some hope that despite this very grim situation that we are in currently, we still have a way forward if you all work together. And working together, I think the discourse like this is a first step of working together to build a nation that is stronger and better once this pandemic is over. Thank you very much for this, and I wish all of you Teshidele for the remaining sessions.
Thank you, and Kadichel Limbo, for your insightful words. So with this, we would like to request Namgichuran, the moderator for the first panel, to take over the charge.
Kusambula, good morning and welcome to the inaugural session of our 2020 Bhutan Biodemocracy and Resilience Conference. I'm Namgi Choden and I'm a civil servant in Thimpula, and I've always been interested in innovation in the government and the creation of knowledge networks, which seem very essential, at least at the point of time that we're in. I'm also a global shaper, which is an initiative of the World Economic Forum. I'm with the Thimphu Hub, and I'm also a climate reality leader. So I commit my time to write, spread awareness, and initiate community projects for climate action. Our topic today is on economic vulnerability and climate crises. two topics that are quite close to my heart, but also two very formidable topics. We're in December now, but as we look back, 2020 has really been a year of all of us scrambling to sit together and then think what just happened. So it has been several meetings and reflections, and everywhere we have heard about the Great Reset, for instance, the need to rethink and reinvent capitalism as we know it, or how it can be business as usual, or to what we are saying right now, to build back better. Economic vulnerability and climate crises as two issues that are complexly related. This notion is not new to us Bhutanese because our development philosophy has always underpinned on looking at economic development and growth holistically, or as His Majesty the King has said, it's development with values. So in our panel today, we think about how we understand all these phrases in the respective sectors that our speakers work on. Broadly speaking, we have an economist, an environmentalist, and a Buddhist practitioner. And legend says that they do not necessarily get along. But you may be surprised that they have more in common that one may let on. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Mr. Gopal Giri, who is the Director of the Department of Macroeconomic Research and Statistics at the Royal Monetary Authority of Bhutan. And yes, he's the economist. He has studied economics at Sheripty College and at the University of Sydney, and he has been with the RMA for over 18 years. In his talk today, we can look forward to the discussion of the current state of the Bhutanese economy and also Bhutan's path towards a green transition, particularly of our financial sectors, which involves the incentives, the products and services and investments, and how that fits in what challenges have come along the way in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our second speaker is Ms. Pem Lama. She is the Director of Landscapes, Enterprise, Agriculture and Forest Program, or the LEAF program, with the Bhutan Ecological Society. Pem graduated with an MBA from Denmark, and she did her undergraduate studies in the United States. She has worked in the areas of economic development, sustainable consumption and production, and in her talk today, we can look forward to her expanding more on these themes, specifically about how economic growth and climate change are issues that cannot be separated, but are rather deeply interrelated. And to really drive home this message, our final speaker is Anim Chopal Pelmo, who is currently at the Kingarapta Nunnery in Tongsa. She will be speaking on ethics, interdependence, and climate change. Ani Chopal became a nun in 1999 after she finished her high school from Eastern Bhutan, and she has been pursuing her studies in Buddhist philosophy in Himachal Pradesh for almost 12 years. She is currently in Bhutan due to the pandemic, and after completing her studies, in about 2 years from now, she hopes to return to Bhutan to teach the nuns here. And now a note to the audience, please feel free to drop your questions either on our Facebook live stream that's going on currently or on Zoom through the Q&A function at any point in our conversation. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to finish their presentation and 5 minutes if needed to wrap up. And then we'll have around 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. I have taken the liberty to prepare some questions, but I will certainly give precedence to engaging more with our audience. So I would highly encourage you to keep the conversation lively. And now, without any further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker. So Gopal sir, the Zoom stage is yours.
Thank you, Namge, for your introduction. And before I begin my discussion, I would like to thank the organizer of the Center for Local Governance and Research and the University of Westminster for giving this excellent platform for us all to discuss the issues related to, the economic vulnerability and climate change. Before I dwell my discussion on the topic that I'm supposed to talk, I would like to set a stage trying to interrelate between democracy and economic development. Sometime I was wondering myself, what is actually a relationship between these two, and climate change coming as a third in this discussion. We know that democracy is an important institution that fosters institutional changes and create new opportunities for the economic development by facilitating, and increasing the efficiency in the factors of production, leading to economic transformation. Democracy creates a good institution for the economic development to progress. In the same way, economic development provides a breeding ground for the democracy to prosper. Economic stability leading to political stability, income inequality, and the higher per capita income. Actually, these are the good enabling environment for democracy to flourish. More importantly, the problem of information asymmetries. If a greater degree of economic development and a more flow of information, this will provide democracy to make correct decisions. With these two interrelationship, and the now climate change become an issue, is a threat for both the institutions I see personally. Even if you look from the economic literature, the popular environmental Kuznets curve, it says that economic degradation has different phases of economic development the country faces. And I was trying to wonder where the Bhutan stands at this point of time. If you look at the economic transformation Bhutan has undergone from 1960s to till date, we are supposed to be in a more like a in between secondary and service sector. But if you look at the data, primary sector continues to employ a very huge, large number of labor force in agriculture sector. And the shift in the factors of production has not taken place in our case. It's purely because our economy is driven by some other exogenous factors like hydro and tourism sector. I think this is very closely revisit and try to see where we are actually standing at this point of time. And definitely economic degradation in a pre-industrial phase will be very high. A neutral phase, and later on economic degradation, environmental degradation, falls as the economy develops over the period of time. Now, I think is very unique in the case of Bhutan. I think most of the countries has already experienced this, and we can cite some of the reference, even looking at the regional countries. But Bhutan has been very fortunate, I should say, and mainly far-sighted leadership of our kings and a prudence in managing our environment coming from our very core Buddhist principles. Buddhism has given this platform for us to conserve our natural resources and environment, basically. And we know that Buddha himself got enlightened from the people tree, closely associated with the environment. And His Majesty has been very far-sighted. The Constitution has provided that, the ground for us to work on. 60% forest coverage all the time. And this is the far-sighted leadership of His Majesty. Again, at the top of this, GNH-based development model has helped us to protect our environment. And these are the enabling environment we have in terms of economic development and conservation of our natural biodiversity and environment. But the recent COVID, the COVID is actually is a shock for our economy as well as for whole country as a whole. And if you look at economic growth, the structure of the economy in a Bhutan case, and look at from the production side, actually, from the supply side, and primary sector constitute about 16% share in the GDP, and followed by around 36% in a secondary sector, largely contributed by hydropower and construction-related hydropower sectors. The remaining around 46% is coming from service sector. And the two sectors combined, the agriculture and secondary sector constitute around 52% in the GDP share. These are all environment related. Hydro is closely associated with the environment, agriculture is closely associated. To that extent, our economy is so much vulnerable to climate change. Now, if you look at the recent pandemic, the growth, economic growth, has come to a negative, as estimated in 2020 October data I'll be talking on, October 2020. GDP growth has dipped down to negative 6.1% because of the COVID pandemic impact. But if you really dissect what are the key drivers of this negative growth, is basically the hardest hit sector comes from the tourism and allied sectors, followed by manufacturing, mining, and construction has been biggest, largely hit. But if you look from the other positive side, hydro and agriculture has actually supported the economic growth to fall into deep recession phase, more than negative. I think we are, again, environment is protecting us. Hydropower has actually supported in growth this time. Otherwise, would have been in double-digit negative growth trajectory. Now, with this, even if you look from the demand side perspective, now from production and the consumption demand, and we know that largely our economy is driven by consumption. Is a consumption-led economy. As Honorable Labor Minister mentioned that everything have to import, and consumption investment hardly much from the public sector driven. If there's no capital expenditure taking place in the government, and even the private sector investment will be put in halt. Now, if you look at roughly around 70% of the total domestic demand comes from actually environment related, and 80% has been contributed by private sector out of this total. And I think now I'll be discussing more on the way forward, because why private sector becomes very important in these dynamics. And private sector is very, very, very at the grassroots level. They are the one who actually impacts all production and consumption functions. Even if you look from the top down, all production function happens at the ground level. There's a whole issue that I'll be discussing in the way forward. And it's very important to know where is the gap right now, as Limpo rightly mentioned, is you have to understand this gap, then come up with the solutions to looking for how to make our economy more resilient. And even if you look at the domestic revenue front, that is becoming, because government expenditure is one of the key drivers of the economy. Without, as a the fiscally dependent economy, without government expenditure, nothing happens. And we can see from this recent COVID experience. And if government is not able to execute their capital expenditure, even the private sector cannot make investment, because they are the more triggers, followed by domestic credit. Now, if you look from the domestic revenue front of the government, there's a key, the main resources for the government to make allocations in various segments of the expenditure, both current and capital. Of the data as of 2019, of the total 39 billion of domestic revenue, I'm excluding grant here, 45% of the revenue actually coming from environment-related sectors. Basically, when I say environment-related sectors, is basically hydro, royalties, dividend, SDF, sustainable development fees, and such environment-related. They're so important, even for the government to from the resource front. Even if you look from the international trade perspective, of 49 billion of total export, almost 72% is actually related to environment export to India. Basically, I'm talking here. Now, if you talk from the import side, of 69 billion import in 2019, 60% of the import is actually non-environment related. That's why how vulnerable we are. On one hand, we are trying to promote environment related. Other hand, we are importing non-environment related imports. We need to be very careful how we manage our both production and consumption function. That's what I wanted to say. Even if you look from the external debt point of view, that is one of them. Currently, 2019, we have around 198 billion external debt, out of which around 97% of the debt is related to environment. If something go wrong in the environmental, the policy or some, this is going to be, we are going to hit hard based on our macroeconomic fundamentals. Now, COVID is just an exceptional. COVID is basically was an eye opener for us to make our economy more resilient. Thanks to His Majesty, the government, for taking a very step forward to mitigate this. But the way forward will be, I think this is the right time to make a discussion and work towards building our economy more resilient. Now, with this economic vulnerabilities that we are posed with, look at the employment, as Limbo mentioned briefly on this. That is one of the biggest challenge that economy is faced with. Because if you look at the demographic profile, because we always keep saying His Majesty has been always emphasizing on younger generation and population pyramid. Our younger generation is the maximum, and they are the future of the country. And but if you don't have a very promising future through that translated through our economic, the development approach, and we will be in deep trouble. And I'm also very worried about future generation, because how much job we create. Our economic development should not be gauged on the per capita income or GDP growth, but we should be gazing in terms of how much new job we create. I think that should be the fundamental for us. How much additional job, hydro demand, because although we are very much committed, 2023, we have committed to migrate to middle income category, because it meets the UN threshold of high per capita income and the human resource index, but we are losing, we have a losing ground in terms of vulnerability index, economic vulnerability index. I think that is very much because important for us to work on. And with this challenges we are confronting, and I would like to divert our attention to one of the major drivers of economy, because since I come from a central bank RMA Development Authority, I'll also be discussing the role of RMA in this economic development through finance perspective. Now, as I mentioned, the key drivers of economy is basically government expenditure. If you look from the supply front, demand front, and followed by the domestic credit. Now, if you look from the right now pandemic situation, since April 2020 till date, from the last 9 months, financial sector has provided around 15 billion, the new loans, worth of new loans, and to that extent, we are supporting the economy. But when you say this, if you look at the credit allocation among sectors, we are not going by the quantum of credit we have allocated in the economy, but the quality matters. What sort of quality, how we are diverting these resources to some of the economic activities of the need. And I think it's very visible. Most of the sectoral credit has been allocated in building and construction in our case, followed by trade, commerce, service and tourism. These are the top five, if I name further, followed by even personal loan, consumption loan has been one of the top. And I think these are not a very desirable sectors that we want to promote. Rather, it should be economic booster we should be focusing on. And agriculture is remain least, continue to remain least. And how we can divert some of the productive resources to the important sectors that can create employment has been one of the focus of the RMA through our financial policy. And green finance comes in the limelight, because although RMA has done so much initiative during the last 3 to 4 years, during the leadership of our Governor, Dr. Penjo. And if I name some of them, Japchor, we call it angel investors, crowdfunding, and currently we are working on impact investment. We call it Bhutan social enterprise. These are the work ongoing. Also, we are working very closely with the Bank of Bhutan and Ministry of Economic Affairs on promoting e-commerce platform for trading platform, and along with the finance. Because before I talk of green finance, I would like to make it clear. When you make these economic activities happen, I think we need to consider all factors of production at the same time. We are talking only from finance. Finance is just one of the factors of production. We have to create an enabling environment from all factors of production: technology, market access, even the entrepreneurial skills. Combine these factors will make happen in a more positive end. Now, all has to be, the emphasis should be made equally in all factors of production, how you focus on. Now, from RMS end, from finance front, we are trying to promote a green finance. Actually, the inspiration is from the G20 group of 20 that was summit during the UN conference. And out of the SDG, 17 SDG goal, the 12th goal basically talks about promoting responsible production consumption based on the pillars of GNH, the principles. Around more than 80 central bank around the world has taken initiative through the alliance AFI. We call it AFI, Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and RM is also one of the players there. And we're trying to promote green finance. Right now, we have prepared a roadmap. It's still in a draft stage. Basically, the main objective of this green finance is to promote a profitable investment in considering the environmental factors with the maximum returns from the environment, at the same time making this environment investment more productive, that can create more employment and support our green economy. That's the whole objective. Now on this, I'll be very brief this because it's still on the work in progress. On the green finance, this framework is actually drawn from the international principles based on 4 Ps. When you say 4 Ps, the Ps stands for promotion, promoting credit to environmental friendly investment areas under the the initiative taken by the government, and we should be providing this through banks and other financial institutions. And other is the promotion. In order to do this, we should have various promotional activities taking place through government initiative in the form of incentive provided to this promoting green investment and other forms. And other is the prevention and protection. These are the 4. Maybe I'll not go detail in this, and is actually an international convention. But the bottom line, to support this, the main the objective as well as the principles, we have come up with the pillars. We have 3 pillars put in place. The first pillar is a governance and a coordination mechanism. Basically, is a governance. We are setting up a committee, a cross-sectoral committee, where we can discuss on what are the priorities of each of these and try to sync with the national objective, and how we operate, including the financial institution and MFIs. And the other thing we will be looking at is the environment and social risk management. Basically talks of promoting green finance, digital insurance, green insurance, and also on the how we can promote various green investment through banks and FIs. The most important, the third, actually, the pillar is on promoting the green finance flows. Actually, these are the resource mobilizing platform we are thinking. And Bhutan has a lot of advantage on this. Bhutan can be a leader in promoting green finance, because most of the Nordic countries, if you refer, they are very keen to make investment in this green initiative. Bhutan has already established a standard benchmark at the international level. And this is how we can discuss, debate, and try to negotiate, and we can attract more investment to promote green This is the platform that we are thinking. But if you look from the classification of various existing loans, because people claim that most of the green loans that we provide is already a green, because we have a very stringent environmental condition to be fulfilled. Because even if you want to do construction, you have to do through various environmental processes, and more or less is green. Bhutan has a very green investment, but we are coming with a various threshold, a green taxonomy. Through the green taxonomy, try to classify various existing loan portfolio into 6 major categories. If I name them, retail financing, corporate financing, to the biodiversity finance, digital finance is very important, and RMA has been putting a lot of effort in this, and even project finance related to hydropower. Actually, broadly, we have classified 6 broad areas, and RMA will be working along with the various other stakeholders to promote this investment. Now, with this, I think I'll.
Yes.
Okay, I'll go to the last of my section.
To wrap up.
Maybe I'll take more time.
We can take more time in the Q&A also.
Okay. I think now this is very important part of my discussion, because the weakness we have identified some of the weakness in a macroeconomic system, and how we can now I see this is a very serious issue. I think Lempo also put in a very serious note in his opening remarks. Sometimes I feel everything is good in the paper in our case, but implementation has been one of the biggest challenges we are facing. Sometimes I feel very much that we have to do this economic development initiative more like a religion. You have to do like a religion, with compassion, with dedication, and with faith. And I think we used to say, like Diglam Namjase. I think we don't have Diglam Namja in the case of doing production and consumption. And I think with that spirit, if you can do, I think we can do this. And involving the grassroots level, I think that's one of the most important I see personally, because right now every production function and consumption function is coming from the grassroots level, and unless they are doing at the grassroots level, I think at the national level you have to provide only a broad guiding principles, and more like a project-based, implementation, and followed by a GYOC, a Dzongkhak, and as a national level. That's very important. And more important I see is education advocacy is very important, and for the youth and the future generation on this, how to pursue this economic development and various productive activities. We can encourage them, building and sensitizing the youth as well as the younger generation. And the third area I was thinking is on, how we can reorient our development models based on the green principles, based on a sustainable. I think we have many things to do, because more like a practical sense. I mean a practical sense, not just in a paper. And I think impact investment try to do in a similar way. And more than this, as Lempo mentioned, I need to have a very clear roadmap for economic, how to attain a green and digital economy over the long term. More, I look from a more strategic point of view, how we can promote a strategic economic development, taking this COVID and the climate change keep in mind. With this, maybe I'll end my presentation. I'll keep if you have any issues during the discussion point. Thank you.
Thank you, Gopal sir. It's certainly not the end of this conversation, because it has received quite a lot of responses. Before we move on to our second speaker, perhaps I'll just point out some areas where I got a lot of questions coming in. So I think the allocation issue that you mentioned, that piqued quite a lot of interest, because people want to know, so why do we have this issue, and what sort of innovations, what are we doing differently, and what kind of new incentives are we creating to really drive the results that we say we need and we know, but so far we've kind of been on a rocky road towards that. Your mention of impact investing as well, I think there's we may have to have a short brief discussion on that during our Q&A session as well. I absolutely loved your final points, which maybe I'll give you a little bit of time during our Q&A to elaborate on stakeholder collaboration and local grassroots level participation, because people at that level know what's best for them. And as we try to push this new paradigm for policy making, which is not top down, but rather is fed from the bottom up. So these are some very important and exciting issues that Gopal sir has brought up. And our second speaker, I would now like to invite Opem Lama. So the Zoom stage on to you.
Thank you. Hi, good morning, everyone. I have a little presentation to share. I think I can do that right here. Is it visible to everyone? Okay. All right. Good morning once again. My name is Pam. Thank you, Namge, for that introduction, and thank you, Sir Gopal, for introducing this topic and this session to everyone. I think you have done a lot of my work actually in terms of linking economy with the environment. But I hope to take this forward a little bit and to talk a little bit about the interrelationship and also the relationship really between climate change and building economic resilience. Because while we want to get on a path of economic recovery soon after COVID, because the economy has been impacted largely, as Namge mentioned earlier, the climate change and sort of the environmental realities cannot be separate from building economic resilience. So I hope to shed a little bit of light in terms of looking at climate change and how Bhutan's economic resilience and economic recovery might be affected and should be cognizant of climate change realities. So the content of our presentation will be basically talking a little bit about our geographic and economic realities, some of our climate vulnerabilities, and also how we then build economic resilience within the context of COVID, as well as these climate vulnerabilities and realities. And hopefully, and this can probably lead to a more discussion in the Q&A session about what is our sustainable future then. So the first thing is just geographic and economic realities of Bhutan. This we all know. I'll go very briefly through it, but we all know we are a developing landlocked country, very small, in between two giants. Our economy is very small and not very competitive. As Gopal sir mentioned, we are a very consumption-led economy. We produce very little. We are also prone, like in terms of geography, we're prone to landslides and a lot of, I would say we just have a very precarious and mountainous landscape, which can be very vulnerable to some of the climate change realities in the near future. And in similar vein, we have a lot of glaciers and glacial lakes. And although we think of climate change mostly as rising sea levels, one of the greatest threats of I think our geographical reality is that a lot of our lakes, if they are impacted or when they will be impacted by climate change, that will be significant to our population and to our economy really. We also know that we are, as Gopal sir mentioned, heavily dependent on some of very climate sensitive economic sectors, such as hydropower and agriculture. I don't think I have to explain this much more for you to know how these two sectors link very much to some of the climate change realities. And I think with hydropower, we know that that's the highest revenue generator, and agriculture may not be that, but we know that that employs or engages a lot of our population. So these are two big sectors that are also very, very linked to climate change realities. So what are Bhutan's climate vulnerabilities? Before I go into that, this is a picture damaged by, I think, a windstorm or a thunderstorm somewhere in the south some years ago. And you can see how vast the damage can be. So what are some pertinent threats in Bhutan with regard to climate change? Firstly, the glacial lake outburst floods. I don't know if Namge is old enough to remember this, but I remember this many years ago when I was a small child. There was an outburst flood and Punakha was flooded and there was a huge concern. And this can be a very frequent reality for Bhutan moving forward if climate change exists and if temperatures continue to rise. And we know that this is a reality. It's not an if, it's a when. Land degradation, as I mentioned, is one of pertinent threats in Bhutan just due to our landscape and how we are. And it's not just landslides, but it also results in erosion, which affects obviously agriculture. Flash floods are very intense in the southern regions of Bhutan. And similarly, droughts can be persistent as well. And this already in some parts of Bhutan, water scarcity has been reported over the years. And we already know that this is an existing problem. Similarly, wind, hail, and thunderstorms, as well as pests and diseases, which I think is very relevant and, of course, doesn't need much explanation in terms of what we are facing with COVID-19, which we all know started, from a disease or a virus that really started from some of the wildlife, as you know, from China. So with climate change, I think the different types of pests and diseases that can come about can be novel, which can be very difficult for us to deal with as we are facing right now. So within that reality, what are some of the economic resilience methods, or how do we orient ourselves in terms of our economic recovery? I like to use this image because I think it's quite powerful and relevant to us. And I believe that till now, we have looked at it in an opposite way, where the economy is the largest concentric circle and the environment is the smallest. By that, I mean that the economy is seen as the big thing that we all focus on. We have to, growth and development all is based on economy. And there's just a lot of talk about growing economically. In that conversation, climate and environment has been the least, I would say, mentioned and considered. Most of the time, it's like economy has to work for us to, solve poverty or other issues, and which are all fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I do think that changing our perspective and reorienting how we think about our place and the environment's place and the economy's place within our existence would really help us maybe reorient, as Sir Gopal was mentioning a little bit in terms of the learning about it being, that we are compassionate economists, I suppose. I believe this kind of ideal relationship is really what is required moving forward in terms of building economic resilience, but also climate resilience within Bhutan. I wanted to talk a little bit about what is going on with the economic contingency plan on our strategy going forward as we think about economic recovery in Bhutan currently. We know that there are three big sectors. One is the Build Bhutan project, which focuses on construction. The second is tourism resilience. And the third one is food self-sufficiency or agriculture. I went through the economic contingency plan very quickly, and I noticed that for Build Bhutan project, it is focused on reskilling, upskilling, engaging youth, really providing employment through construction, and also as a measure to solve some of the construction constraints we've had that Sir Gopal mentioned before. In tourism resilience, they talk about reskilling, upskilling again. They talk a little bit about, again, generating employment, into system integration of tourism, etc. And finally, in food self-sufficiency, they talk about really increasing the production of different agricultural and livestock products in Bhutan. You can see these are quite vast and many. But in all of these conversations, or in all of these three, I'll just go through a little bit again back. In all of these three projects, there's very little, I think, mention and consideration of how climate change or how we really factor in sustainable development within our contingency plan, when that is really the overarching goal that Bhutan has been talking about throughout. And by that, I mean, in terms of Build Bhutan projects, like construction doesn't really talk about sustainable building materials, for example, or in tourism resilience, it really hardly talks about anything between environment and tourism, when environment and Bhutan's clean air is really the main goal or attraction for a lot of tourists. And similar to food sufficiency and agriculture, I believe the talks of sustainable agriculture, maybe agroforestry systems, practices that we know are good for the environment and also helps climate change, have not featured very much in terms of how I see it. And this can be something that we have to be cognizant about. And I hope in this Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about how again, depending on how we have to change our perspective about how we think about environment and climate change when we talk about economic recovery. And why that is important is that climate reality and economic recovery, as we know, is very closely related. As I mentioned, water resources and sort of change in hydrological or rainfall patterns can severely impact water. And in Bhutan, hydropower generation is our biggest revenue earner. And if this is impacted, like what is our alternative and how do we move forward? This is something we don't talk about very much. Or even if we recognize it, we don't actively try to mitigate or I suppose readjust our thinking in terms of alternative energy, for example, or how we even protect our water resources. Similarly, I think if we think about agriculture, forest and biodiversity, some of the natural disaster resources, all of these climate realities that you see on screen right now will somehow affect all of our economic sectors, whether that is construction, whether that is agriculture and our consumption, and even tourism, because not only will we not get the sustainable development fees, which is one of the, I think, second highest revenue earner for Bhutan, but Bhutan will also be less attractive to tourists, right? If we are not as clean or as green or as sustainable as we are. So what is our sustainable future? That brings us to that big question. And I think I always say whenever I present, although I have spoken and worked on development and I guess environment and sustainable development for a few years, the answer is really open. And I think I cannot provide answers. But what I would like to do is provide some maybe food for thought. And I think for what our sustainable future looks like, we have to really think about number one, adaptation, and number two, mitigation, when we think about all the different economic sectors I just mentioned. And what I mean by that is that for adaptation, we really have to think about if water resources are impacted, and water is our biggest source of energy generation, we have to think about alternate energy, right? So maybe invest in solar or wind or whatever else is there out there, biogas. And these are things that have been talked about and have been, I would say, piloted and explored in Bhutan. But I think with COVID now and with this economic recovery plans, we have to start thinking even more about some of these areas in energy, for example. And adaptation can work in all the other sectors as well. In tourism, adapting to new climate change realities. If some areas are not as attractive, I mean, how are ways we can still attract tourists, or still have a sector that is functional in the face of climate reality. And adaptation is very much important, I think, even in agriculture, in terms of thinking about what are the different ways that our climate is going to change in specific areas in Bhutan, which will affect the crops that we grow. And how do we change that? How do we use innovation and technology to adapt to climate change realities in agriculture? So yeah, adaptation is one thing. And the other is mitigation, which is because prevention is we're too far long gone in terms of climate change to really prevent it from happening, but we can mitigate it in terms of reducing the impact of climate change. And with that, I see a lot of relevance in the construction sector, where we are looking at energy efficiency, that building materials, for example, climate resilient infrastructures. So for example, if there is landslide in Bhutan and it affects, let's say, a water pipeline or the roads in Bhutan, right? Like, what are the ways we can start building more resilient infrastructure in the face of climate change realities? So I think those are some of the, again, these are just ideas. I'm happy to hear more from our attendees and our panel as we move forward at this conversation. So how do we build it? I think Sir Gopal has provided some really good lead in terms of how we build it. So I won't go too into it, but as he was speaking, I was thinking about a few things that came to mind. Were that the first thing that's important right now, as we start reinvesting our money to reboost our economy or reboot our economy, is to think about where we put our money, right? Where do we invest? And as Sir Gopal mentioned, we are a very consumption-led economy, which means we just don't really invest, we just spend. We buy cars, we buy clothes, we import our shoes, our, I don't know, makeup products. I mean, whatever we think, we really just consume then produce. So a lot of our money is just going on to things that are not really generating much in terms of the economy, in terms of jobs, in terms of food for ourselves. So I think one thing we have to think about as we move forward is, where do we put our money? Where do we invest? Are these sustainable sectors? Are these job generating sectors? Are these climate resilient sectors? So I think that's one thing. I also think the other thing that's important is to look at, how do we build skills in face of climate change realities, and also with the sort of perspective of creating sustainable employment and gainful employment for the Bhutanese. So these kind of reskilling can be, again, directed towards not just learning plumbing, but maybe sustainable plumbing. I don't know if there's something like that, but I think Bhutan can pioneer a lot of these ideas where we are not just learning some of the skills we don't have, but we are learning in a better way, in a more sustainable way, in a more economic, environmentally aware way. And that we can apply to tourism, that we can apply to agriculture, that we can apply to construction, we can apply to energy and all of that. So I think those are some of the ideas I have in mind that came to me. And I really believe that, even with tourism, where we think that climate change or environment is kind of far removed from it somehow, that there are so many relevance, that there are so many interconnections that we can already start thinking about. And perhaps that type of interconnected sort of awareness can help us really build the future that we want. And I would like to end with this I guess, graphic, where I think our vision in Bhutan as a Jain society, as someone who wants to do better, as a country that wants to do better, is a great vision to have. And I think we should still keep that vision, and our desired future should still be, alongside that vision. But that our current reality, and especially with the COVID realities right now, there is a huge gap. And so how we get from our current reality to our vision will really require us to work in more innovative and transformative ways. Thank you. Back to you, Namge.
Thank you, Aupem. And I hope the attendants have had their thoughts provoked as much as I've been scrupulously making notes right now. So we began with thinking about economic vulnerability, so shocks to the economy that can be external, that can be internal. And as Sir Gopal previously mentioned, we are on our path to graduate to a middle income country, and to have a low economic vulnerability index is one of our goals as a country, to really stay there in the middle income zone. But I love how Aupem Lama brought up some very important questions that we need to ask in terms of translating what we say into our actions, because when we look at all the sectors that we rely on to bring in the money to keep us at that level, where is the sustainability aspect to that? And this is not a difficult question, because by asking that question, we also get to think about a lot of opportunities, and we could have a little more discussion on that in our Q&A session. So with opportunities also comes hope. Aupem talked about adapting and mitigating as two important strategies. And you also ended with this beautiful question, what does our sustainable... But I really like how our panelists and the topics that they have chosen are really flowing nicely into each other, because for our final speaker today, Ani Chopel, she could perhaps give us a little more insight, especially from the spiritual aspect of where do we start thinking. And at the end of it, it boils down to individual actions and choices that maybe we can all work then towards creating meaningful systemic change. So I would like to now welcome Annie Chopel for her talk on climate change, ethics, and interdependence.
Thank you, Namge. Firstly, I would like to begin by greeting everyone here on the panel a very good morning. And I would also like to thank the coordinators and everyone involved for initiating such a wonderful program and having me as a part of it. Unity is one of the hallmarks we have in Bhutan from time immemorial, and I believe this is one of the greatest weapons that has kept us united during this crucial time. And also, it has allowed, this is what has allowed our beloved king and the frontliners to fight this deadly virus. Despite some drawbacks, it's also something we can rejoice to see how majority of our citizens have been responding during this crisis. And I would like to grab this opportunity to send my heartfelt message to everyone to thank for their timely and unfailing service to our country. Well, I haven't prepared any slides or anything like that, so I will be basically talking. So bear with me for another 15 minutes or so. Anyways, this is quite amazing how people from all walks of life are connected here on one screen. And this is one perfect example of how interdependence can come into play. And also one positive aspect of social media. Well, I believe, as Namgi said, I was invited here to share my thoughts from the Buddhist perspective, but I would like to make it clear that what I may speak might not be limited to Buddhist ideology alone. In one of his books, Beyond Religion, His Holiness the Dalai Lama gives an analogy of tea and water to explain religion and ethics. Religion is like water. Religion is like tea. Without it, we can't survive. But ethics is like water. Without it, there is no possibility of survival. What I'm trying to convey here is that ethics are not something that is limited to spirituality. Love, respect, empathy, and compassion, consideration for others, and so forth. These are some of the ethical guides which are actually the basic necessities for our survival. Good news here is that these qualities are not borrowed from elsewhere, but they are, each one of us are born with these innate qualities. All we need to do is to expand or make them manifest. But without a certain degree of training or practice, these qualities can hardly stretch beyond your inner circles of friends and families. You may wonder why I'm talking about ethics, but I believe it plays a very crucial role in mitigating the environmental crisis we are facing in the world today. Our attitudes shape our actions, and from our actions, we create the world we live in. Therefore, if you wish to help others, it's crucial that the change begins from ourselves first. Well, there could be many factors for this environmental crisis, but two definite ones are: one, being ignorant or having no access to the knowledge about the situation, and two, knowing but not taking the responsibility, which is the worst. And we humans need a wake-up call every once in a while. And I think this pandemic is just one of them. In fact, any kind of adversities or catastrophes can be a wake-up call from which we can learn and improve. Of course, unless we make some effort to change our attitudes and actions afterwards, nothing is really going to happen, because after sometimes everything will seem normal and people will do the same thing all over again as if nothing has happened. This is actually what happens when we do not take the message to our hearts. During this time, it has become more obvious how everything is linked to one another. It was observed how one careless and irresponsible move can affect many lives. This is just one example on a grosser level, but on subtle level, this rule doesn't apply only to the COVID case, but it applies to all external and internal modes of existence. We completely remain unaware of how dependent we are to the outside world, when in fact our very existence is based on it. We hardly consider the source of our livelihood, our income, and so forth. For example, those tireless hands working elsewhere to provide for us just remain beyond our narrow view, and they are often forgotten completely. There's a saying, and I quote, if poor do not work, rich cannot eat their money, which is actually very true, you know. But then how many of us actually consider this? And there is one terminology in Buddhist texts called Nöchu. And I'm tempted to use this word because this term carries a very deep meaning about the interdependent nature. The world we live in is referred to as the content. Um, no, and the inhabitants are referred to as chu, or the contents, or in other words, nutrients. The container and contents are connected in such a way that when one is affected, it has a direct impact on the other. An obvious example would be when we have natural calamities like earthquakes and so forth, the contents are affected naturally. Likewise, when the contents are corrosive, it affects the container, which is what's happening to our world these days. So reflecting on this analogy can give us a deeper sense of how interdependence can work from both sides. It has also become very clear how we humans have been affecting our Mother Earth. When the many countries imposed lockdown policies, just within a couple of days, air and rivers become clearer, and stars were visible at nights in some of the most polluted cities of the world. This gives us a hope that our Earth can actually heal if we can be more kind and gentle to it. Although Bhutan doesn't have to worry about this kind of situation as of now, good isn't enough if we can do better, because improvement has no limit. By preserving and improving what we already have, I think we can contribute a lot to the whole planet. I also believe it's important to remind ourselves again and again that of how fortunate we are to be born in Bhutan. I'm telling this because we humans are creatures of nature, and so when we live in certain conditions for long enough, we tend to forget or appreciate the things we have until it becomes too late. And coming back to ethics, um, when we develop a deeper understanding of how we all are connected, we develop a love, respect, and consideration for a wider audience. And in that way, our selfish attitudes will dissipate naturally. Thus, we learn to take responsibility for the actions we perform, and we do not act on spot, but rather consider the consequences in the long run that may affect yourself and others. It's also crucial that we remind ourselves that we're not acting alone in our actions, be it good or bad. And imagine the ripple effect of the collective actions of 7 billion human beings if we were to act in the same way. Um, there's no one way out solution for this environmental crisis. It's not just influential industrial leaders or political leaders or thinkers stepping in and doing their parts. We as individuals must also take our responsibility by doing our part. And by doing so, we collectively produce a far-reaching positive impact on our whole planet. Although Bhutan may be doing quite well, we must be aware of how we are adapting our lives with exposure to the rapid growth in their technological fields. And I believe this kind of conference can serve as a media to spread the awareness to our younger generations. And it was found that consumption of meat, dairy products, plastics, food waste, these are some of the major contributors to the global warming. And I believe waste and plastics have become a great concern to Bhutan as well, and an alternative must be sought sooner than later. And from a general and Buddhist perspective, both, I feel that we can contribute a lot to our planet if we limit our meat and dairy consumption, and also consumerism habits, which has become one of the greatest problems. And this was touched by my earlier speakers as well. Um, His Holiness the 17th Kyawang Kamapa, who is one of the environmental activists, said, and I quote, "In our modern world, consumerism has become the new religion on which we place our faith. Consequently, we see no difference between what we need and what we want. We actually need very little, but we want everything. Scientists have explained that we could have 3 or 4 planets, and this would still not be enough to satisfy our desires. This creates a very difficult situation since our wants have no limit, but natural resources do have limits and cannot possibly fulfill our desires. Therefore, we have to be more content with what we have." So, being content here doesn't necessarily mean falling into certain extremes, but rather maintaining a proper balance between the outer material world and the inner world. Because after all, no matter how much material wealth you may have, if that's going to disconnect you from the inner world, then you'll still live in poverty. And this directly contradicts the GNH principles we have. When you have taken refuge and placed your faith in the material world, you have already taken a risk. And this is usually what happens. Some unhealthy situations set in, and you often end up thinking that this is the end of the world. This is because you're not prepared mentally to face the uncertainties which are a sure thing to happen. And I would also like to share one very good advice that an Indian master called Nagarjuna said about the motivations we need to cultivate when we eat. He said that we must consume our food considering it to be a medicine and for the sole purpose of the survival of our body, and must not consume it with negative emotions such as attachment, anger, and so forth. This means we do not need to engage in some fun game of eating or drinking competition that we see so much on social media these days, when half the population of the world even cannot afford to have 1 or 2 decent meals. Um, I can also offer 2 alternatives in which we can eat, stop the meat or reduce the meat consumption. One, obviously for health reasons, and 2, consideration for others' health, others' lives, sorry, which can be referred to as compassion. And again, imagine the ripple effect on our planet if at least half the population of the world, or even half the population of Bhutan, can shift their diet to a plant-based diet, and if there is zero food waste. And finally, as an independent organization and also as individuals, I believe these are some of the initiatives we can take to help combat climate change. And lastly, we must not forget that all beings, irrespective of any race or religion, share one common ground, and that is wanting to be happy and not wanting suffering. And reflecting on this can unite us all as one family and can overcome any kinds of differences that divides us. And I would like to thank everyone for your time, and forgive me if my speech seemed so monotonous. Thank you.
Absolutely not, Ani. I'm also looking at the comments on our Facebook live stream, and I think people have used words such as deeply resonating and powerful. And of course, I share the same sentiments. And what you said about ethics not just being in the realm of spirituality, but rather being also deeply rooted in how we think of public policy. That public policy also needs to embody love and compassion and kindness. I think this is one of it's a very profound key takeaway for me personally as somebody who's quite interested in the whole process. So I would like to thank you for that. Um, and we have come to the speakers' presentations. So if you just give me a moment, I'm going to set a timer for myself. We can spend around 30 to 40 minutes with the Q&A, and we're also on questions to the Q&A box, and I just realized that this panelists have already taken the initiative to answer the questions, but this is not visible to everybody. So we could sort through some of them. I've looked at all the questions and I'm not going to read them out individually because a lot of them are quite similar. Instead, what I have done is sort of grouped them thematically, and I would like to have the speakers share their thoughts briefly on the questions. So our first question, I'm going to start off with this because with the COVID-19 and all of us staying at home and global demand generally declining, we have seen something of an environmental reset where we have seen reduced CO2 carbon emissions for a while. And this has made climate action advocates excited because they're like, okay, this is finally the result that we're seeing. But on the other hand, we also have major climate discussions and initiatives at multilateral intergovernment levels being delayed. So on the other hand, people are not very optimistic. I'd like to hear, especially from Sir Gopal and Aupem and Ani Chopal, if you'd like to add in as well, where this conversation on climate change currently is, because we do know that it's so interrelated to economic vulnerability, but in the face of very urgent issues such as unemployment, joblessness, people almost going into poverty, climate change seems like such an abstract and distant issue. But like we just said, this is really not the case. But where do you think the conversation currently is in Bhutan, globally?
I think, okay, Namge, maybe I'll start with my thoughts on this. I think Bhutan is far ahead of the climate change issues than any of the countries, is what I feel. Because before this sustainable development concept came in, Bhutan has already been doing, but there's no record, as such, because our visionary leaders, His Majesty, has already put in place some of the conservation effort that I mentioned in my presentations, coming from our Buddhist values. And now when the G20 countries talks at that forum, and all the countries are asked to do this, SDG, Millennium Development Goal, SDG goals, this is not a new concept for us, is what I feel. It has already been there in our economic development policies, implementation phase. And I think now what we have to do is, we have to sharpen this, sharpen these ideas into practicality, and focusing on our own natural endowment, what we really want at the end of the day. We should have a clear target, how we can bring our future generation to this, who will be the beneficiary out of these policies. But we don't have a clear roadmap right now, because often we are, guided by the laissez-faire type policies, like more like a capitalistic mentality and a profit, always looking from profitability, more returns, not looking from the other aspect. But we will be asked to repay at some point of time. I think the world is already repaying in some of the the irresponsible way of consumption. I think Ani Chopel has already mentioned the greed of accumulation of wealth. And we only have a single planet on this earth, who has water and natural resources. There's no other planet besides Earth. But how optimally we can make use of the natural resources we have with a few, only few people wants to take the credit out of this. I think it's not fair. And the climate change issues comes here. And only the big nations, advanced nations want to take advantage. But the impact of this will be faced by every one of us who live in this planet. And I think COVID is a form of one. This is more like how judiciously we make use of our common public goods like environment. This is what I feel.
If I can add to Sir Gopal's response, I think in terms, I still would like to remain positive that COVID has all in all woken us up to some of the challenges, or I guess some of the things that were just not working in the world and challenged us. It has removed the veil, so to speak, from some of the issues that we face as a society, and certainly in environmental and climate change areas as well. As Sir Gopal mentioned, I do think that Bhutan has been leading this idea for a very long time, and that COVID, with some of the COVID crisis, what we now need to do is revisit or re-strengthen maybe some of our strategies that we already had in place. I do agree with Sir Gopal that I think this is one of my criticism, I think, of Bhutan, that we have great policies, we have a great vision, but it just seems like all talk and no action. In terms of putting things into action for anything that we do, whether it's buying or investments or consumption or anything else, or even our education, for example, I feel like, again, that perspective I talked about having that ecological perspective, sustainable perspective has been missing. We've been borrowing a lot of models that did not have this perspective at all. So, even if we said we want to have a very responsible G&H education, our curriculum has been developed through maybe some other examples that didn't have that thought in mind. So I feel like with a lot of other policies as well, when it comes to operationalizing and really putting it in action, there just hasn't been that type of awareness, environmental awareness or sustainable mindsets. So I think COVID, like I said, has provided us that opportunity to rethink, to take a breather, to really zoom out and look at our lives and assess what we're doing right and wrong. So I do think this is an opportunity, and I would like to still remain optimistic that though there is more urgency for economic development and much more of just rebooting the economy, that hopefully we have become a little bit more aware as people, and maybe a little bit more Buddhist for Bhutanese to be able to view our economy and our society with a much broader lens than we have till now. Sorry, I think Namga, you're muted.
Ani Chopel, would you have anything to add on to that?
Not so much, but as I mentioned earlier, we, as individuals can do so much. You don't have to wait for your government to start an initiative of something like that. You can, if you want to change the world, the change must begin from yourself. So it don't need to be something very big. Rather you can just start by picking up a trash that you see on your way, or anything. You can begin by doing something small, and then from that you have to start. Otherwise, if you leave it for someone else, then I don't think anything is going to happen. So we have to start from yourself. So that's what I wanted to say. Other than that, my other speakers, they already said, and I agree to that as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So based on the discussion that we just had, I'm going to ask the second question, that climate change, a lot of people think that there is a free riding problem there. So take Bhutan for instance, and I'm just playing the I'm just playing the devil's advocate here because Bhutan as a country, we've always been very happy to take on our role as an advocate for pro-climate everything. So we are carbon neutral. We are absorbing all the carbon that our neighboring countries may emit. And we're taking a lot of the burden. And some people may say, well, then what are the other parties doing? They seem to benefit off of it immensely, economically, at the cost of what we have compromised. So I remember having this conversation with Gopal sir as well. I'd like to hear a little more about how we can capitalize off of this notion and turn it a little more positive and say, how can we benefit off of Bhutan's initiatives and reputation as a pro-climate country? Autile, in the questions, she asked about the possibility of carbon trading, for instance. And again, this is a very, very new idea, just nascent, but I'm sure you would have interesting things to say about it. So very briefly, Aupem and Sir Gopal.
Would you like me to go first? Okay.
Okay. Actually, this is just a thought, this is a thought. I don't know how we can work on this, because sometimes this is just my random thought came to my mind, because we have been saying Bhutan is a hotspot, a global hotspot of the biodiversity hotspot, and rich and natural endowment and pristine environment. But we are yet to harness the economic benefit out of this. And how do we harness the economic benefit, all this, the hard labor our forebears have put in to achieve this? Sometimes I see this, our foresters, our forest officials running around the clock, protecting our environment, day and night, guarding our natural endowment. And does this have a cost at the end of the day? There is cost. But how do we, make this as a more like a rewarding benefit for the countries at the country level? That's my thinking, because our forests are protecting like their own vegetable gardens. To that extent, we conserve our environment, and but there should be economic gain out of this. I'm thinking from economic perspective. And how do we harness this benefit? Even I was thinking while negotiating the loans with the donors, is there any way to do this? And just my thought. And since we are a green economy, a green country, do we have certain concession for this, for doing this? Because these are talking from the global level. Because usually what's happening, as my understanding, all these terms and conditions of accessing these concessional and are based on the general principles. If you are LDC, you will get that all LDC will give same and with the same conditions, but all these factors are not really factored in that properly, is what I see. And if there's a way, I was just saying, if there's a way for Bhutan and other countries who are doing aggressively conservation policy to have certain relaxation in some of the, because it's good, because they are doing for the global good, not only for the country good, it's for the global good, because our conservation is going to, is a public goods. It will going to impact everybody. And I think we need to think along this line and try to work out some of the mechanisms. And this is just my thought, a random thought. My apology if I have really is out of, thanks.
Maybe if I can add a little bit, thank you for the question, Namge, and I have answered it there as well to Otile, but I do think that this is the carbon trading, as you were asking if this is something good, if we should use this to our advantage. I personally think that we should, although there are some criticisms about carbon trading in general globally, where it says that carbon trading only enables the emitting countries to do more of bad work. So environmentally, globally speaking, it is not it's not that good of a measure. That's some of the criticism. I do think at this moment, like for Bhutan, who is a small developing country that is also has our greatest resource is really our natural resource. So because we already have something that people need, I do think that to fund for our development, to fund for some of the social welfare that we still do as a country, right? To provide free healthcare, free education. I mean, these things do take money, and we can't keep borrowing, especially in the next few years when we graduate from the least developing countries. We have to think about alternative economic sources. So I do think carbon trading is a good measure, not only because it still enables us to keep our trees and forests, but it also, when you look at the profile of who will be benefiting, it really is the rural farmers and people who have undeveloped land, which from a global climate change perspective is a much more advantageous place to be in, right? So if we want people to plant trees, to conserve them, to keep large amounts of land green, somehow they have to benefit. Because if we only make them, if economically our farmers are still disadvantaged while they still have a lot of greenery, that just doesn't make sense. So I do think integrating some sort of community carbon banks will be actually very useful for the country. And I also wanted to touch upon some of the another question I saw on the Q&A where I think Sir Purba Wangchuk was talking about medicinal plants and Bhutan being the land of medicinal plants, and how do we use that? Can this also be one of the ways that we can promote what we know indigenously and the knowledge and the wisdom we have while still funding development? And I actually think it's an excellent idea. I also think it would be interesting if Bhutan not just became I think if we became pioneers for a lot of things with climate change and with certain species maybe adapting or not adapting to climate change, we can be at the front line of looking at how forests are working, how our natural environment is reacting to climate change. And this is something like in the world, I feel like if we can invest in that kind of research and that kind of time in doing that, like Bhutan can be a leader. So I do think there are certain resources within Bhutan that can be definitely used to our advantage at this point to fund our development. Thank you.
Thank you, Open. Before we go on to the next question, what about impact investment? Because that came out quite a bit, and we have a diverse range of audience here, and they may not necessarily be familiar with what impact investments or what impact investment funds are. So if Gopal sir or Abem could briefly share Impact Investment 101.
I think there's a little bit premature to discuss on impact management. It's still a work in progress right now, and consultant has been working on this developing a framework. That's what last time, and I feel not comfortable to, and I don't feel comfortable myself to talk at this point of time because we are yet to see the framework developed by the consultant. But the idea here is that I can share the idea because this is more like a, this is a collaboration between the RMA and the donors and the Ministry of Agriculture. Ministry of Agriculture will be the very important partner in this, where we can look at in different Dzongkhag, the capabilities of the Dzongkhag to produce different types of commodities is through value chain link, and like even production to value chain, and based on the competitive advantage of each of the Dzongkhag, such facility will be provided. The financing facility will be provided with a close, very good handholding of the Ministry of Agriculture in the technical front. That's the idea. And promoting agro-based activities. This basically targeting basically the youth. Youth is the targeted segment of the population. And I think this is more like one gigawatt, one product concept. Much more, this is more built from the environmental front of view. Like we say, some of the Dzongkhag may be good at producing medicinal plants. Some may be good at producing a textile product. And based on the comparative advantage of each of the localities, build on this social enterprise. When you say social endowment, the social capital is there. If there's a social capital, and they will be the one who will be able to make this happen. Like this concept is actually a blend of, is a mixture of all the ideas between sustainable, based on the social endowment concept, based on access to finance, based on the government support. This is more like a hybrid model that we are thinking. But again, this is something, not a final. We are yet to see the document, and once it's developed, and definitely we'll have a mass consultation. And that will be the point we will be discussing in a length and breadth of the issue. Thanks.
Namgi, if I can just maybe briefly give my opinion, and not that I know anything about impact investment, and I definitely don't know what's going on in the Bhutanese context, but I do think that what it should do, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, what this is, the question we are asking is, where do we put our money, as I said. And so with impact investment, I think there are two things we should think about: the social impact and the environmental impact. So the greatest social impact with the least environmental impact would be like my kind of impact investment. And I think that can be done in various ways, where I just mentioned earlier, there are various advantages that Bhutan has in terms of our natural resources. And I think we have to now focus on also building some of our own capacity, human resources, in reorienting our skill sets, right? To make ourselves not just like sustainable entrepreneurs, but just also people who are cognizant of, I think when I think someone mentioned sustainable forestry, or, still we're talking about cutting down trees. Is that good or bad? I mean, there are a lot of trade-offs that we need to be aware of. So it's in no way am I trying to sell this idea that we should all just, hug trees and not do that, because I think, or not harm our environment, because I think the idea here is to coexist, to minimize our impact, while also making sure that socially we are providing for the basic needs. But as my panelist Ani Chofil also just mentioned earlier, we have to differentiate between our needs and wants as well. Sometimes I think some of the consumption habits really impact what we think as a demand. I mean, if everyone is demanding mink coats, everyone is going to start producing or like killing animals to make fur coats, but it doesn't necessarily really fit into this idea that we want. So I think it has to be, I feel like in terms of impact investments as well, it has to be, like I said, looking at greatest social impact with the least environmental impact, and really just having that awareness. I think if we can take away anything from this panel discussion, it would be to think about economy with much more sustainable, compassionate, like a different.
Very nicely put. So I hope our audience can make a little note of this very catchy phrase that Opam just made. Most social impact with the least environmental impact. That is impact investment 101. So now moving on to a question that's a little more challenging. I've also, of course, sympathized with this feeling, and I've also seen a couple of comments on it across where we're streaming this. People being very fatigued of what we keep saying, because so for instance, take agriculture and the construction sector. We've known this for so long that this is an issue. We need more resources there. We need more people to innovate there. And after a while, it's beyond an individual's capability to really transform these sectors. And again, this is where systemic rethinking of our policies and the way we do things come in. And again, this conversation, especially in agriculture and the construction sectors, have come up so as very rich avenues for employment, opportunities. But I think it would also be good to reflect on why we haven't really been able to achieve certain advancements that we may wanted to have in these sectors. So the question really is, going forward now, after the COVID-19 pandemic, what are some things that we're doing very differently in these two sectors, or it can be any sectors, where we have innovated on the incentives? So what are we doing differently this time? And it can be any sectors, not just agriculture or construction.
If I may put my thoughts on this. This is purely my thought, because how I see agriculture sector in my context, and again, giving the geographical, the topography, Bhutan has a landscape and fertility, soil fertility. We need to have a certain consideration. We cannot replicate the other countries that are doing, because my sense is that agriculture can do much more than what we have been doing right now. And first thing is that, but we need to explore what Bhutan will be good at and what sort of agricultural production, that we need to be very clear. And sometimes we are often driven by the food self-sufficiency principles, and sometimes there's no economies of scale in our case, because low population, the fertility soil, and the low-lying ability of low-lying plains for doing mass extensive farming is not very constrained. But to me, I see high value, low volume product is a competitive advantage I see in agriculture sector. We have to actually focus on high value products rather than low value product, because like rice is very important. I understand the importance of rice in Bhutanese dietary. We need rice. Every 3 course of food we take in rice, is essential. But we cannot do mass production in this, because there is no economic scale. We cannot harness the benefit out of this. We cannot compete with any of these rice producing countries like India, other countries. Rather, it will be cheaper for us to import rather than produce our own. It's very cost expensive. Rather, we can make use of our, the land in producing high value products, like anything. If I name some of the high value, could be a cardamom in the south, cordyceps in the north, similar things, like medicinal plants. All these are the high value product. And I think we need to have a clear, otherwise we'll not be able to meet, and at the same time, optimize the optimal use of our natural, like 8% we are talking arable land, 8%, let me 10%. How we can optimize the land use in this category, we have to think, so that we can substitute. Those essentials can be substituted easily, If I export high value, and I can easily import much more than that to meet my need. And I think that should be the principle, is what I think. Otherwise, specializing in rice production will not be able to take us in through a high income. That's one. Other hand, the why agriculture is not growing is that we are yet to build the agriculture through a value chain. Because not only production front, the recent experience during the COVID, like all the cabbage are rotting in the warehouse. These are something very disappointing news, because if you look at from the economic front of view, the only producer in the system is the farmers. Farmers are the only producer. We all are consumers, the rest of the, and we should not, penalize farmers, the single producer. Rather, we have to support them, producer, all the time. And if you kill the producer, he will not produce. And sometimes I think the cobweb model of model, we have to understand this cobweb model. Because in agriculture production takes at least a gestation period is required. Today, I cultivate and harvest. I need certain time, maybe 6 months, a year to get that produce. And I'll be driven by the historical prices, because whether it's an incentive for me to produce that particular product. But there should be strong agriculture pricing policy put in place, so that we protect the interests of the farmers in terms of pricing. And if we protect the interests of the farmers will continue to produce without any disruption in the production cycle. But right now, what we are doing is we are rather tempted by the controlling the price. That is actually, we need to work out this, how we can protect the farmers and assure the price, so that he continue to produce. And it should be linked to the value chain, from production to distribution to market chain, that we need to develop. And then only people will take up farming as a productive ventures. Otherwise, just to fill our stomach or subsistence level, this farming is not going to help, and cannot be enterprising farming. Thank you.
Right.
Okay, I'll just put my 2 cents very, very quickly, Namge. What are we doing right? Or, um, because we've talked about things a lot. I think with COVID, one thing that has happened is that, well, obviously our consumption has drastically lowered, which I think again is one. Although having said that, I did read statistics that import of vehicles was at an all-time high this year. So we still are consuming, but I do think that we have become more aware of how much we are dependent on external products and commodities for our own consumption. So I do think it has been sort of an awareness, which is a good thing. I also think it's a good thing that because a lot of youth were returning and a lot of the construction workers were sent back, that this refocus on reskilling our own Bhutanese is a very good thing, because at the end of the day, I think the best solution really is to go local in every sense of the word. And I know, like, I would like to believe I'm a global citizen, and I appreciate what we learn from the outside world. But I do think that to create the reality that we wish to create, we wish to live in, we really need to skill ourselves to make that reality happen. So I do think reskilling of youth in terms of becoming, plumbers and technicians and construction people is a good move forward. I do think that it would be even better, like I said, to reskill them with a more sustainable skills, like more green skills, more environmentally aware skills in the same thing that they're doing. Even if you're a teacher, you can be a more aware teacher in terms of the environmental realities. And so same thing like that, I think you can apply it to anything else. So I do think that one thing that HR reskilling is a good thing. I also think it's a good thing that because tourism was kind of cut short, a lot of the guides and people in the hospitality sector started going back to their farmlands and farming and sort of reconnecting themselves with nature and what they knew before. And I think also just generating this kind of conversation where we have had to take a mandatory pause and have had to rethink. We have a lot of, as Sir Gopal will probably attest to, a lot of our economists policymakers were challenged because of COVID to really rethink about our sustainability as a country and as a society. So I think all of those things are actually positive developments, and I understand the need to be cynical or jaded because we've heard this so many times before. But again, like, I remain positive that COVID has in fact helped us rethink a little bit more and made it just a little real. That Bhutan's development, if we don't rethink or start doing things better now, that future may not exist.
Absolutely. And, the notion of being a global citizen is very alluring, but when it really comes down to making a change, you have to think about the immediate community that you're in and what sort of actions you can take to make an impact there. And I recently read that that's called being a public citizen, and that's a very nice way to put it. And it's also about coming back to the broader themes of this conference. It's called Biodemocracy and Resilience. So when we look at the democracy part of it, that's really how you engage with it locally, rather than going all big and only just thinking from a global citizen's perspective, although that's also important. So we have now almost come to the end of this very nice conversation. And to end off, I would just like to go do one round. I'll start from Ani Chopal. So COVID-19, it has made us rethink many things, and it seems so trite when I say it out loud. But we have learned that it's more valuable to create rather than consume. And this is something that I'm going to be taking on to the new year. As a New Year's resolution, I'm going to try to create more instead of consuming blindly and impulsively. So if each of our speakers could give maybe one or two actionable things, motivation, advice on how we could all walk away from this and think about creating more than consuming.
Actually, what I need to say, I think I summed up everything in my presentation, but still then I would like to just say that we already have learned so much from this crisis, that from this pandemic, that we all are connected, and so we have to realize this and have to have a consideration for a wider audience. And I would like to say that to be closer to your friends and families, and not to be, to be friend with someone on the to some electronic version that you don't really know. And the best thing would be to be closer to your friends and families, and because they are the ones that will help you at the time of your needs. And otherwise, these days people are so obsessed with the media that we almost lost connection with our close ones. So this is what I want to deliver.
Open.
Yeah, I was trying to think about creating, but I think sometimes, I mean, of course, from a policymaker's more an economic perspective, I do think creating opportunities, incentivizing that should be important in terms of, like I have been mentioning, areas where we are much more aware and ecologically oriented. So creating opportunities in those areas. I also think that there can be a lot of revisiting and synchronizing and synthesizing some of our policies, and not just policies, but a lot of the rules and regulations that seem to somehow come into conflict sometimes. And when people, like you and I, or some entrepreneur goes out there to do something which is innovative, they have a lot of stories of how they're not able to do it, and so they feel like the system does not support them. So I think helping the creators as well in terms of synthesizing and making enabling environment is very important. But as Ani also mentioned, I would like to sort of echo the fact that I think sometimes it's not even about creating. When we think it's just maybe rethinking and doing things the better way. There was a funny cartoon that is actually coming to my mind about this person who is maybe taking water, or like in the morning he's getting water from the well, and that was before enlightenment, and even after enlightenment it's the same thing. And so people just on looking it don't really see the difference. But the difference really is more internal. And I do think that just in general, in the work that I've done so far and in my experience, I do think that there is a lot of external information that has already been created. And maybe some of the work we need to do now is more an internal transformation. So yeah, even in economy or in policy making, I think we can all learn from that process. So yeah, I think doing things the same way, doing the same things but differently.
I think this is a very, difficult to say. I have many to say, but I don't know how to put it. And maybe we have to learn. We have to watch the nature. Nature. Nature is our teacher, and we have to closely follow the nature's stone, whatever action we do. Sometimes I'm inspired by the ants' behavior. Ant. I think we should working like ant spirit. They never fight. They work very diligently. They carry small food and pass it in a very coordinated manner. They line up, and how they work, and that is spirit. I like the ant spirit of working. And I mentioned in my presentation that every actions we should be working like a religion. We should be working like a religion with devotion, and the silos that we have in our existing system. Everybody working in their own, and we are not, the coordinating, cross coordination is lacking, and cooperation, interventions, all these are not working in a very more like a holistic manner. I think if you can resort all these issues, removing all form of silos within our system, we should be doing good enough in terms of in policy, in terms of implementation, whatever. And definitely this COVID has taught us the lesson to go for economic diversification. There's no option. This is a critical. One of the economic diversification is very crucial for us, because we are depending on the single sectors like hydro. That was actually a relief. Right now we have received, but how long? There could be another different form of natural calamity later on. And I think that this COVID is one of the eye opener for all of us, even for the small nations, even to the big nations. The most powerful nations are shaken by this COVID, and they are talking of a big, the superpower in military. If you talk at supersonic missiles to tackle, they have capabilities to do this. A simple bioorganism had shattered their, this is actually this is against mankind. How vulnerable is a modern human civilization? This is proven by the COVID. And I think we cannot ignore the fundamentals. We cannot ignore the basic fundamentals of our life. And that is a lesson that we have to start building from the grassroots level fundamentals. And rather than thinking big and trying to do something bigger without building a strong foundation. There's a lesson I learned from the COVID. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So the COVID-19 has really tested, but also reaffirmed democracies all over the world. And after our very riveting panel today, I think one important takeaway would be to be more mindful, observe, to care. And in the end, maybe this is how we can bring about transformation, not only at an individual level, but also at a systemic level. I would like to thank all the panelists who joined me today, and I had such a great time. And as always, I brought my curiosity and my desire to learn. And thank you so much for indulging me. I would also like to thank our very engaging audience. Thank you all for your important questions. And because of this, we were able to go on for another 40 minutes or so. And okay, so it's dark here, but I would like to invite our participants to move on to the next session. I think it's at 1:30 p.m. BST. And so thank you all for joining. Over to the organizers now.
Lason, Madam Namgi Chiran from New Delhi. Thank you so much for this wonderful discourse for almost for 2 hours. And I hope that all the participants, looking at their wonderful comments, it's so encouraging to receive such comments and feedback from our participants and observers here. So thank you so much, Anichafal Pamo, Madam Pamlama, and Sir Gopalgiri. Thank you so much. And as Namgi pointed out, our next session will be on voluntarism and public health, and it will exactly begin at 1:30 p.m. Thank you so much. See you then. Bye-bye.
Wait.
Yeah, Natasha.
Just wanted to say that, because as you mentioned, there's firstly want to thank everyone involved, all of the panelists. You raised so many interesting ideas. We've got, there's so much here that you can see from the audience engagement too. But also I just want it to be, everyone here to know that if this is just the beginning, so if you have other questions, if you have ideas that come to your mind, things you want to think further, things you want other people to think further and want to channelize through what we are doing, please do send that through as well. So this is, although this was just a panel, it's not just a panel, it's a conversation. That's all.